Welcome back to the 2021 MTSS Summer Institute. I'm going to introduce Dr. Gary Duhon. He is a professor of school psychology in Oklahoma State University. His teaching and research interests include intervention development, behavioral consultation, pre-referral intervention models, and applied behavioral analysis. Dr. Duhon has worked with schools around the country on installing and maintaining tiered systems of support for more than 20 years and currently works with the Oklahoma State Department of Education regarding implementation of MTSS models across the state. And he's going to be speaking about working from a firm foundation. So I'm going to introduce him right now. It's Dr. Gary Duhon.
Good morning, everybody. We good to go, Miss Beth Ann?
Yes.
All right, I'm going to share screen and I'm going to see if I can make this work.
Looks good.
Looking good. All right.
Yes.
Well, welcome everybody. We're going to talk about evaluating your Tier 1 system. Dr. Shin did a great job this morning about talking about the importance of a good, effective Tier 1 system. And I'm going to talk about how to take that Tier 1 system and look at it more critically to evaluate what components are working effectively and what components aren't working effectively. One of the things I'll tell you before we get started is Tier 1s go all the way from, Tier 1 is everything we do. It's all the way from kindergarten through 12th grade. So the components of the evaluation system may look different depending upon what grade you're teaching, what subjects you're teaching, whether it's social, emotional, behavioral, math, reading, writing. But this presentation is going to deal with just this concept of evaluation, and you'll just have to fill in the specific content that you're going to be evaluating, whether it be 10th grade algebra or 2nd grade reading. So with that, we'll get started. So first off, quick review. What is Tier 1? Tier 1 is the instruction delivered to all students. It is our core curriculum. It is our academic, behavioral, social, emotional expectations we have for everyone. So everyone gets it, and the goal is to have a majority of students respond to it. One way I like to think about it is the intervention everyone gets. Tier 2 and Tier 3 are interventions specifically designed for kids with more intensive needs. Well, Tier 1 is the intervention we give to everyone. And theoretically, we should evaluate it in a similar way that we evaluate the interventions delivered at Tier 2 and Tier 3. The necessity of Tier 1 effectiveness. Tier 1 is the foundation for all tiers. And if Tier 1 is not working, it will sabotage and undermine the effectiveness of Tier 2 and Tier 3. Poorly implemented Tier 1 systems overload Tier 2 and Tier 3 and result in nothing being effective. So I've seen lots of systems where they spend a lot of their time ensuring that Tier 2 and Tier 3 are in place and functioning, and that's great. But if Tier 1's ineffective, we end up having too many kids receiving or needing Tier 2 and Tier 3 services, and the system cannot support that. So being efficient and not undermining your tiered system is really critical. But the presence of Tier 1 curriculum is not enough. It must be effective. If it's not effective, all our gains are lost. So determining the effectiveness of Tier 1 can be a complicated process and is not a simple, quick check. There are a lot of steps involved, and I've got in my title, I've got 10 steps laid out for you guys as you go through the process of evaluating your Tier 1 system. But it's vital. And maybe even more critical than evaluating Tier 2 and Tier 3, because more kids are affected and impacted by Tier 1 than Tier 2 and Tier 3. What should we evaluate when it comes to Tier 1? Well, like any other instructional approach, both the process and the outcome are important. The process, what we're delivering and how we're delivering it in Tier 1 should be evaluated, but also the impact on student performance and student success. That is it working question should be asked. So both process and outcome are critical with evaluation, and both should be examined closely. What processes do we need to evaluate? Well, implementation integrity is where we'll really start. Is the curriculum being implemented as designed? Now that doesn't ask the same question, is the curriculum a good curriculum? But even if it is a good curriculum, if it's not implemented accurately, it's not going to be effective. So implementation integrity is critical. We're also going to be asking, is the curriculum an effective curriculum or evidence-based curriculum that Dr. Shin talked about earlier? But that's a different question, and we get that information in a different way. What outcomes do we need to evaluate? Well, we need to evaluate the effectiveness. Is the delivery having an impact on student achievement? If it's not producing adequate student achievement, it's not effective. It's not working. There's something wrong with the system. But we've got to ask those questions. We've got to gather that data. Measurement of student performance becomes a primary outcome of the curriculum, and therefore it's got to be collected and evaluated systematically. So before we get started and jump into the evaluation process, a couple things I want you guys to keep in mind. This is a multi-step cyclical process, and it's designed to identify areas of concern, come up with solutions or attempts to address those areas of concern, and evaluate impact. It really is a problem-solving approach. And if you're familiar with the problem-solving approach, identify the problem, come up with a solution, implement the solution, evaluate the solution. That's what we're really talking about at the systems level. Evaluation should also be completed by a team of stakeholders at whatever level is being examined. This is not a one-man show. One person should not be responsible for evaluating Tier 1 implementation or Tier 1 effectiveness. This has got to be a result of an interaction between multiple experts and stakeholders. And if you're examining Tier 1 at the district level, district personnel need to be involved. If you're examining at the site level, site personnel need to be involved. These people have to have an investment in the data, understand where the data comes from and the practices that are going on in the school, but they also have to have the authority and the resources to respond to the evaluation. Just identifying a problem is insufficient. Having the resources, the time, the personnel to make the changes necessary to improve your Tier 1 becomes a critical part of this process. And without that, we're going to be ineffective. Last thing is, and probably one of the most difficult ones to overcome, is everything should be up for review. Nothing is sacred, nothing is off limits. And if you will listen to Dr. Shin's presentation, one of the things he talked about is some of the political and social beliefs that drive practices in schools. Some of those things, as we evaluate them, we will identify as ineffective. Sometimes it's hard to get people to change something they've done for 20 years or something they truly believe in or something they've been taught to believe in. But everything's got to be up for review, and everything's got to be, nothing should be sacred in this except for positive student outcomes. So keeping those things in mind, let's start breaking down the process. And step one is identifying your data source. Problem-solving approaches require data. We're going to utilize data to drive this process. So we need to identify first and foremost, what are our data sources to evaluate both outcomes and process. What data can be used to evaluate Tier 1 processes and outcomes? This data needs to be both reliable and timely for evaluation. Reliable, you got to have confidence in this data that it is meaningful, valid, and represents what you want it to represent. But it also has to be timely. The data has to be collected frequently enough, and you have to evaluate it soon enough after it's collected so it can be useful. Understanding what happened 3 years ago is not useful today. We need to know what's going on now in the classrooms in terms of process and outcome. The outcomes are, what outcomes are typically impacted for Tier 1? Well, you can look at grades, screening data, state assessment data, common formative assessment, but understanding this data, the strengths and the weaknesses of this data are very important. One of the things that often shocks me when I work with schools is how unreliable and inconsistent schools believe grades are. And I'll say that again. This is not my interpretation. School personnel will tell you grades are inconsistent. They're not valid. That's a shocker. And if that's the case where you're at, grades are probably not going to be a good indicator of success or effectiveness of tier one outcomes. We may need more objective measures. Now, if you have good objective grading procedures in your school, it may be very useful. But if they're not objective and consistent, maybe they're not great tools. Screening data is also a useful tool, and things like reading through the Reading Sufficiency Act were required to collect this data multiple times a year for K-3 reading. But in areas where we don't have screening data, we're missing this also. So we've got to make sure we've got screening data collected, but that screening data also must be collected in a reliable and valid way. Something you might ask yourself as you're looking at this data or trying to determine what data to collect is, when's the last time we trained our teachers on collecting this data? If it's computer collected data, if you're using one of the tools that's automated, do we effectively monitor collecting this data by having teachers in the room, or sufficient amount of teachers in the room when kids are on the computer? Are you confident this data is reliable and valid? State assessment data is also another form of data we can utilize to evaluate tier one. The downside with state assessment data is that timeliness. It's not as timely as we'd like it to be. It comes at the end of the year and it tells us about how we did last year and may not be as related to what's going on this year. Another form of data, outcome data, would be common formative assessments. If you've got well-developed and well-designed common formative assessments that link well to your curriculum materials and the standards for that subject area, those might be a good option too. The point here is there are lots of different outcome data you can collect, but you've got to be confident that this outcome data is valid and can be useful in examining the effectiveness of your system. Another type of data we need to collect is process data. This is the curricular implementation and the curricular alignment. Is the curriculum being implemented correctly? Is it being implemented consistently? Do teachers know how to do it, how to implement the curriculum? And is that curriculum well aligned with the needs of the student and the expectations for the school? We'll talk about how to get this data in a little bit. Once you've identified the data that you're going to collect, you need to collect it and organize it and present it to the stakeholders. So organizing and summarizing the data is important. And this is one of the pieces that I think a lot of people struggle with, because not everybody's data savvy. But tables and graphs can be very useful in simplifying large data sets. If you think about reviewing tier one data for an entire district, that's quite a bit of data in a lot of different areas. To be able to look at that data collectively, we need to summarize it effectively. That should be organized around a few questions. Question one is, what is the degree of implementation integrity? How well are we implementing this curriculum? And then the other question is, what is the level of student achievement? When we talk about implementation, we really ask the question, is implementation adequate? And it's a really simple question, but it's a little loaded, because adequate implementation will vary depending upon what you're doing. It depends upon what's being implemented. There's some research about some practices in terms of what degree of implementation is adequate. Some publishers specify what level of implementation is necessary to get the desired effect for a specific curriculum or set of curriculum materials. As a general rule, any deviation from 100% implementation should be noted, but how much deviation from that is going to be specific to the topic area, the curriculum, and the research supporting that curriculum. Data should be collected regarding implementation at the district, school, grade, and class level. We should look at this across all areas so that we can identify patterns of issues, whether we have patterns at the district level, school, grade, and those can be remediated appropriately when we start talking about addressing those concerns. Effectiveness, the question that drives this is the curriculum effective at improving student achievement? The general stance is 80%. 80% of students should respond to this core curriculum. If fewer than 80% of the students respond to the curriculum, it's not effective enough for your population. Now, what does respond mean? Well, typically we refer to this as at or above benchmark on screeners or other assessments, meeting grade level performance indicators. So that's one criterion you can look at. That should be collected, again, on the effectiveness of your curriculum, both at the district, school, grade, and class level, and it should be organized in such a way to where they can be reviewed at these different levels. The third step in the process is to systematically review the data. Using these predetermined evaluative questions that we talked about in step 2, try to answer them. Is implementation integrity adequate? Are students responding to the instruction? This should be done, like I indicated earlier, by the larger stakeholders group and experts with an understanding of the data and the power to make change. Again, if we're just looking at this ourselves and we have no ability to make these changes, we're not going to be as effective. Review the assessment results starting with the very broadest level and working down. This is, again, another strategy that's very effective in simplifying the process, but also identifying the targets at their most impactful level. We start by reviewing this data at the district level. If we identify areas of concern, let's say for student outcomes for reading at the district level, we don't need to go down to the school, the grade, or the class level. We've got to address the district level concerns first, and then we can move down the more fundamental levels. Same thing with implementation. If I've got implementation issues with our math curriculum at the district level, we need to address those before we go down to the school, the grade, or the class level. Step 4, identifying the areas of weakness. Based upon the review of the data in step 3, identify any areas and locations of weakness in delivery and impact. This tells us specifically where the concern is, but it's not enough. Further analysis of these targets is necessary to address the concerns. Just knowing that we've got an implementation issue in reading at the 3rd grade level in this specific school is not enough to solve the problem. It just tells us where the problem is. Just like when we're identifying student academic concerns, just knowing that Gary has trouble with reading is not enough to solve the problem. We need to understand the reading concern. We also need to understand the implementation concerns or the outcome concerns. Examples, things to think about, if we've got a district-wide reading, district-wide achievement is below standard in reading. This is a broad-based concern. This is an outcome concern, but we'll need to dig in a little deeper to find out what's causing this discrepancy in what is expected and what is being achieved. A site-wide writing instruction is not happening. Maybe we've got a writing curriculum that's not being implemented correctly or not being implemented at all. That's an integrity issue. That's a process issue. The next question would be why. If we've got a 3rd grade math accuracy issue, that's an outcome issue. Again, that's a particular area of the concern, but we need to dig a little deeper to understand what's causing that accuracy issue. Is it a curricular issue? What's going on? And we'll dig into that in the next step. Ms. Smith's 7th grade algebra is not receiving instructional and factorials. That's a classroom issue, but why? Where is it coming from? What's causing this? And that brings us to step 5, analyzing the weakness in more detail. And this is a really critical part because identifying the problems is not actually that difficult. If you talk to your administrators or your superintendents, they'll tell you where the areas of weakness are. They've looked at the data, but understanding why becomes a little bit more complicated. And what we're trying to do is we're determining the factors that contribute to the area of curricular weakness. Likely culprits, and we'll talk about 4 of them. There could be more, but these are the 4 that I see the most. Implementation of curriculum, assessment process, curricular alignment, and curriculum effectiveness. We'll talk about each one of them separately. Implementation issues. In order to evaluate implementation issues where we're not seeing adequate implementation, there are a couple of different assessment techniques you can utilize. Surveys, observations, and a review of permanent products will let you know if teachers know how to implement the curriculum and if they have time and resources to implement. And this is really critical. If you surveyed your teachers and asked them how well they're implementing curriculum, most of them will be usually are honest and tell you what they're doing well and what they're not doing well, what they feel supported with and what they don't. Walkthroughs, administrators walking through and observing the curriculum being implemented can tell you quite a bit about what's happening, what's not happening. Oftentimes, teachers don't know what they don't know. They may not know they're implementing the curriculum inaccurately or inconsistently. But a walkthrough by someone who's trained and has a good knowledge base about what implementation should look like can be very useful. The last piece to implementation, I don't want to undersell, is ensuring that there's time and resources to implement the curriculum. Is the curriculum not being implemented consistently or completely because we're not allowing the time? If the curriculum materials require 90 minutes to implement and we're only giving 50-minute blocks, that could be a problem. And these are things we need to look at. Evaluating our assessment tools. Sometimes our assessment tools don't match up well with curricular delivery. They don't match up in terms of timing of assessing what's been taught, or maybe they don't match up at all with regard to what's being delivered in the classroom versus what's being assessed. This is an alignment issue, and that would need to be addressed. Poor curricular alignment. Sometimes we see school districts implement curriculums and there are either gaps in the curriculum or redundancies. The redundancies are overlaps in the curriculum that may not be necessary, that reduce time to access other curriculum materials. But more importantly, when we see the gaps in the curricular alignment. Quick story, I worked with an elementary school several years back, and after screening the first grade kids at the beginning of the year, we concluded there was serious deficits in letter sound knowledge on the part of the first graders when they walked into the building. A quick review of the kindergarten curriculum showed that the kindergarten teachers weren't teaching all the letter sounds, just bottom line. And that's a curricular gap that the first grade teachers had to address, but by working together, they were able to resolve that issue. Those curricular gaps are important, and finding those curricular gaps is critical in solving this problem. The final one is poor curriculum. Bottom line, some curriculums are not evidence-based, some curriculums are not effective, and there's just no way around that. To evaluate these, we've got to review the curricular components to see if they're evidence-based, to see if they incorporate all the components we need to. Dr. Shin talked quite a bit this morning about what good, the science of reading tells us about what a good reading curriculum is. We also know we also know quite a bit about math and writing and behavioral and social emotional curriculums. So we can review these curriculum and identify if they have the critical components for effectiveness or if they're missing those components. Once we've boiled down and drilled down to the key problems that we're seeing with our Tier 1 curriculum, we need to prioritize the areas of need. This is where it gets a little bit difficult. We'll need to identify what to target. I'd be shocked if any school we work with would identify only one singular curricular issue or Tier 1 issue. Most of us will identify multiple Tier 1 issues. And we're probably not going to be able to address them all simultaneously. So we need to strategize and prioritize the steps in resolving these issues. And when we prioritize, there's three things I like to talk about. One is breadth of impact. Two is effective use of resources, and three is likelihood of success. And each one of them is really important in moving forward and making some decisions about how to resolve these concerns. Breadth of impact is, by making this change, how many children will we positively impact? How many teachers will we positively impact? If it's a large number, that's that good breadth of impact. It should be prioritized high. If it's only addressing the needs of a few, maybe that should be prioritized at a lower level. Not that it's not important, not that it's not something we need to address, but relative to something that has a bigger impact, we might want to hit that first. Effective use of resources. You may not know this, but schools have limited resources. That's a joke. That's I know we don't. Schools have very limited resources. How can we effectively use our resources to address these concerns? If fixing a specific concern is going to cost us $4 million and take 23 personnel changes, that's a pretty significant use of resources. We may want to identify a concern that has similar breadth of impact, but uses fewer resources to get things moving more quickly. We don't want access to resources being a reason why we don't address a concern. And the last one, likelihood of success. Not that we shouldn't assume we can be effective with all of these issues, but some issues are more easily fixed or addressed than others. And I like to start out with things that are more easy to address than the more difficult ones, all other things being equal, to build some momentum and build upon that success. If we can make small changes and see big impacts, it gets people excited about making these changes, and they can see the fruits of their labor or the impact of their work, and they're more likely to come along when things get a little bit more difficult. So prioritizing the areas of concern that you've identified in step 5, really important. Now, step 7, link the problem to solution. Sounds pretty simple. We identify problem X, we want solution that matches up with problem X. When we're talking about implementation solutions, this is really a fidelity issue, or they're not, for whatever reason, the curriculum is not being implemented correctly, fully, whatnot. To address this, we look at, we need to plan professional development and training with direct observation, coaching, follow-up, and feedback. One of the things to keep in mind is if teachers aren't implementing the curriculum correctly, it may be because they don't know how, or they haven't had enough practice. And sometimes it's because they don't know they don't know. So providing professional development, following that up with direct observation and coaching as appropriate is going to ensure that everybody who's being asked to implement that curriculum has the skills present to do so. You don't ever want that to be the reason why it's not happening. They just don't know. Something to keep in mind, and I know this is not something you guys aren't aware of, but I want to say it out loud. With the amount of teacher turnover we have in Oklahoma and the amount of emergency certified teachers we have, you cannot assume that every teacher in your building knows what you mean when you say implement the curriculum with integrity. So we need to make sure that we are following through with this and we're monitoring this on a regular basis. Another thing to keep in mind is, and I mentioned this earlier, making sure that there's appropriate resources allocated to the teacher so that they can implement the curriculum as designed. And these resources can be resources in terms of materials, personnel, or time. Do they have the materials they need? If we don't give them the materials, how can we expect them to implement it? Do they have the personnel? If the curriculum requires additional personnel to support implementation, do they have it? And do they have the time? This is one of the ones I see quite a bit. We're asking them to implement a 90-minute curriculum or instructional process in a 50 or 60-minute block just because we don't have the time. That's setting them up for failure, and we don't want to do that. So if the problem is in implementation issues, think training. think professional development, think direct observation and coaching, and also ensure that the resources are present for good implementation. Inadequate assessment tools. This can be a mismatch between what is taught and what is tested, or simply poorly designed tests. How often do we implement our screening tools and we see there's not a good match between our core curriculum? When that's the case, those assessment tools maybe don't produce the most valid data. It doesn't mean the curriculum's not working. It doesn't mean the curriculum is working, but it means we can't answer the question, how well is the curriculum working, until we update or revise our assessment tools. We've got to have good assessment tools that give us good information. So if our assessment tools aren't adequate, we need to take the time to either create new assessment tools or identify assessment tools that are more appropriate for our students and for the curriculum materials that are being delivered. Poor curriculum alignment, what is taught and what the students need are not well matched. This can be a moving target. As your populations and demographics change over the years, what worked one year may not be sufficient the next year in terms of curricular alignment. That's why good screening tools up front are nice to identify where kids are at, and we need to make adjustments in our curriculum. It's always a good idea to engage in curricular alignment activities as frequently as possible, both horizontal and vertical alignment, so that we can make sure that we don't have obvious gaps or holes in our curriculum, and we're being efficient as we can with the delivery of that curriculum. Poor curriculum alignment can be a huge issue, and it simply passes the buck to the next grade level and gives them more to provide instruction upon, and makes it more difficult to be effective. The last likely issue that you'll come across would be a lack of evidence-based curriculum. The curriculum is simply poorly designed or not present at all. Some curriculums are bad curriculums. Even if the publishers say they're not bad, some curriculums are bad curriculums. In some schools I've worked with have no particular curriculum materials whatsoever to guide instruction. Teachers are left to fend for themselves. Either one of these options are not very good. If there's no curriculum, or no curriculum materials, and teachers are basically left to their own devices. Good teachers will figure it out. Teachers with less skills or less experience may struggle significantly. Solution: identify and purchase new evidence-based curriculum whenever possible, or if that's not possible, supplement the existing curriculum based upon an examination of its deficits. Now, I mentioned early on in this presentation, watch out for, or everything's up fair game, nothing is sacred here. This is the one thing that oftentimes becomes that sacred cow, for lack of a better descriptor, in many schools. They are not willing to abandon a poor curriculum. Why? Well, somebody spent a lot of money on that curriculum. Somebody's reputation might be at stake, and they're not willing to abandon the curriculum that they just spent $4 million on because there's no evidence for its use. I've been there, I've seen districts who've done that. In those cases, your best option is to identify the deficits the curriculum possesses and to supplement that curriculum. It's again more work. It'd be nice if it was in one nice package, but you've got to fix that. This can't be overlooked. If the curriculum is not evidence-based or has clear deficits in it, we've got to fix that. So that's the solution that we've got to attempt to address. The next step is developing an action plan. We've gathered this data. We've got our concerns laid out on the table. We know we prioritize them. We know what we're addressing first. We know how we're addressing it. Now we need a game plan. And this part of the process, step 8, developing this action plan, is really critical for being effective. We can spend a lot of time talking about these issues in schools, But unless we do something about it, nothing's going to change. This guides the do part, the action. First thing, we need a goal. What are we going to address? Are we going to address implementation fidelity in 5th grade algebra class? Are we going to address math fluency, or not math fluency, reading, decoding in 1st grade? What are we going to address? Then we need to lay out steps in the plan for how we're going to do that, all the actions taken, who's going to be responsible, who are our people charged with engaging in these solutions, what's the timeline for completion, what's our evidence for completion. This action plan process is very powerful and very useful, and when you meet as that stakeholders team over and over again across the year, you refer back to this action plan to determine what's working, what's not working, what we need to do next to move on. Step 9, implement the plan. Towards this, they've got the time to do it, they've got the resources to make this happen. Because if not, it's not going to happen. We don't have a lot of spare time in school, so we need to make sure that we take the time to dedicate towards this process, and the personnel and the resources need to be dedicated. Not only is this necessary for implementation, but unless adequate resources are devoted to implementation, staff will not see this as a priority and it will not likely be successful. Let me restate that for a minute. If administration doesn't dedicate the resources and the time to this process, why would the teachers? If they don't see it as necessary enough to meet on, to talk about, and to evaluate, why would anybody else believe it? And so when administration dedicates the time for it, it becomes important for the teachers, and it becomes something, a meaningful activity for them. Last step in the process, evaluate the effects. Refer back to step 1 and see if your solution resulted in change. And again, this is that cyclical process. Step 1 was gathering information. Once you've implemented the solution, go back and gather that information again. The information that triggered your concerns, has something changed? Using the same assessment data at the end will give you a better understanding of any changes achieved as part of the process. Remember, sometimes there's a delay in the impact on student outcomes. Modifying, improving implementation, integrity of a particular curriculum component, hopefully will have an impact on student outcomes, but it may be delayed. It may take a couple of years to see that impact. But you should be able to see changes in practices almost immediately after implementing one of these solutions. Practice changes are easy to see and easy to monitor if you're looking. Student outcomes take a little bit longer sometimes to see. Even if you improve reading instruction, it may be a couple of years before you see the number of kids at risk go down. We've done this for several years, and we've seen this pattern. It takes two to 3 years to sort of see these at-risk student numbers start to drive down. Questions?
Everyone is muted, but feel free to put your questions in the chat box and we will relay them to Dr. Duhon.
I'm going to stop sharing and we'll talk. I can send, Kristen, I can send you a copy of the PowerPoint. And if you want to distribute that.
Yeah, that would be great. As soon as you send it to me and we get a list of the participants, we will email it on to everyone who attended this session.
Awesome.
Were there any questions in the chat?
There are none so far. But y'all, we have like 30 more minutes with Dr. Duhon.
This was short, and I struggled with this presentation because to build a tier 1 evaluation for elementary reading is very different than high school social emotional. And so we've got to have, those steps hopefully will give you sort of a guide to walking through this process with whatever aspect of tier one you're evaluating.
So we do have requests for the PowerPoint. We will make sure and get that to you guys.
Awesome.
And just double checking to see if there are any other questions. Oh,
I actually just put the file
dropped
to
it in.
the PowerPoint in the chat for everyone.
perfect, perfect.
Do any of you already evaluate your tier one regularly, consistently?
My suspicion, Kristen, is, oh, Victoria does.
So there is one person who does. I'm hoping that you still found some utility in this session and learned something about how you all might improve that evaluation process. What was your suspicion, Dr. Duhon?
I suspect many schools don't because it is difficult. It takes quite a bit of time and resources to systematically evaluate all aspects of tier one. When you think about it, evaluating reading tier one is one thing, but evaluating reading, math, writing, and social emotional / behavior for all grades, that's a large task.
Gary, we do have a
I did not
question.
hear Victoria mentioned in the chat about Dr. Shin's rubric. Victoria, my suspicion is I've probably seen it, but I'm not sure what you're referring to.
Here, let me see if I can pull that for you. It's so hard to manage these chats in this format. We'd love to be able to open up mics and video cameras.
Wait, we can do this in person.
In person.
And because I much prefer engaging people in person.
Yes.
But hopefully next time.
Gary, Victoria clarified a little bit more, and she said in his presentation this morning, he mentioned using rubrics to evaluate tier one. And she thinks he had links in his presentation. Have you ever used a rubric to evaluate tier one?
I have not, but I'm sure whatever Dr. Shin's got is probably pretty good and probably aligns somewhat to what I presented today. It's very simple. The details become difficult. Identify your data sources, compare your existing data to what you want, what you expect, and then try to hypothesize as to where these discrepancies are coming from, and then come up with a resolution. So it is a multi-step process, and it can be complicated. But yeah, I'll check his presentation and see if I can pull those out, and maybe we can add them to this presentation.
Sounds good. Gary, there is another question. If someone's district isn't evaluating their tier one, how might a school site approach doing this at their level?
It really is the same thing. The district, you could conduct the same evaluation processes at the site level that you do at the district level. You're just looking simply at your site. And this is actually done more consistently than districts, because it's an administrator or principal and their team typically do review their outcome data annually, looking at state testing data, looking at screening data. And, I think the biggest piece we miss with some of this is the ability to take action. When you're dealing with it at the school level, sometimes district policy will prohibit making substantial changes where you see the need. And that's why it's nice to have district on board when you're evaluating your tier 1 system.
Gary, I have a question for you.
Yes, ma'am.
I know that there are likely people in this session right now who are not district administration or even site administration. Do you have any recommendations for teachers on how they might evaluate their own core instruction for improvement?
Yeah, that's two. I'll give you two ideas. One, look at the data. And really simply, if your students aren't responding to your curriculum, we need to make some changes. If the students aren't, if 80% of your students aren't responding to your instruction, there's something wrong with the instructional delivery, and be okay with looking in the mirror and saying, I need to do something different as a teacher. So that's one. The other is to get others to evaluate you, to get colleagues that you respect, that you think are good at what they do, to come watch you deliver instruction. Because it might be the curriculum is poorly designed. It might be you're not implementing it as well as it could be implemented. And as teachers, we need to be open to that evaluation and not be afraid of others' feedback, so that we can better ourselves and be more effective.
Just so everyone knows, Melissa Algram also was able to put in the chat the practice guide for evaluating your ELA curriculum from IES. And then she also put in a curriculum evaluation tool from the Reading League for you all to reference. And that is what Victoria was referring to. So it's there for you too, Gary. And thank you for answering my question. I know that as a teacher, I wasn't sure. I didn't know what I didn't know. And so looking at my own data and evaluating that for improvement would have been super helpful.
Yeah, and that's a good point. There are a lot of teachers out there that don't know what they don't know. And that's why we need, administrators, good administrators will do those walkthroughs and give teachers feedback and provide professional development, or identify professional development for teachers who struggle with implementation issues or organizational issues that impact implementation. But looking at the outcomes is really the first thing we should be doing. Are our students responding like we expect to this curriculum? And if they don't, then we've got to look deeper into the problem and try to identify why.
Are there any other questions or comments for Dr. Duhon? While we wait for people to process and maybe think of any additional questions or comments, I will put the evaluation link in the chat. I checked this one, so if it does not work, please just let me know and I will try one more time.
Also, Kristen was mentioning, I was noticing in the chat that there was some difficulty with Dr. Duhon's PowerPoint, the link. If you had difficulty with that link, Kristen will email that out to all the participants today, the PowerPoint, but we'll also put that, we can get that up on the website, and we will get that up. It will be available if you go into the platform, the Oklahoma Edge platform. We'll have those resources available for you as well with his, with this recording. Any more questions? You can ask him anything.
Yeah, I'll talk about anything. Related or unrelated.
Well, that looks like that may be it. So what that looks like is we're going to have a nice long lunch for everybody, which everybody loves a good long lunch. And then we'll be back here at 1 o'clock for Dr. Shin's breakout session, which is looking at database decision making. So I'm going to let y'all go and remind you that I'm available if anybody needs me. My my contact information is in the chat. Let me put that back out there for you guys just one more time in case anybody needs it. But my contact information is in the chat.
If you think of other questions for Dr. Duhon, he does work with us on the grant regularly, so Beth Ann can forward any additional questions to him after you've had time to process.
Yeah,